What the hell's going on here?
May God have mercy on us all.
Welcome to the ALLAN HANDELMAN Show, a variety of fascinating people from the international world of rock and roll to the conversational newsmakers and authors, from the great television and motion picture talents to the country's funniest comedians.
Canada's one of those countries. You know what they give away? Health insurance!
You never really know what's going to be happening, but we guarantee you a show people will be talking about tomorrow. Now, here's Alan.
It's always been my mission, and many of you have heard me say this many times. The mission has been to serve the rock culture right from the beginning. And I wanted to deal with the subjects and issues that are relevant to that culture. You know, sometimes that culture was called the youth culture or the Woodstock generation. It was people who wanted to change the world for the better, but weren't afraid to protest against authority when it was necessary. The Vietnam War is a prime example of that. And it was the music that was the glue that inspired that youth culture to successfully achieve many of the positive changes. Well, there's a new book out by a great guest, Brad Schreiber, who talks about this subject perfectly. It's called Music is Power, Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change. Brad, it's great having you back on.
Oh, thank you, Alan, and I really appreciate the support you gave me way back 10 years ago was when Becoming Jimi Hendrix, the early years of Jimi, came out, and it was a pleasure to talk to you then and, of course, again now.
Yeah, back in 2009, and then 3 years ago we had you on with a riveting book called Revolution's End about Patty Hearst, the kidnapping, mind control. Phew.
Yeah, CIA, Black Panthers, Ronald Reagan. That was a wild ride.
That was an excellent show. Well, and not to mention you're a TV writer. The True TV series North Mission Road is yours, which is excellent, not surprising.
Thank you.
So let's...
Thank you.
You go ahead.
It's books, I was going to say, Alan. It seems like even though I've written in all forms and done some producing, it's always books that I come back to, and Music is Power is something I wanted to do for a long, long time.
Now, of course, rock and roll, and whether it's psychedelic and, whether it's progressive rock, all the things we're going to talk about, folk music and protest music, it actually goes back about 100 years, what really started it. So spend a moment on the motivation for this book. And also, who are some of the people in the early days you want to pay tribute to that we may not be thinking about anymore? Like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie.
Yeah, well, the first chapter exactly is called Musical Workers of the World Unite. And a lot of people may be familiar with Joan Baez's beautiful version of I Dreamed I Saw Joe Hill last night. Well, Joe Hill really is the start for me of American and European protest music, if you will. I like to call it socially conscious music because protest music is kind of what they called it back in the 60s, and it was kind of, after a while, a very denigrating term.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Hill was a Swedish immigrant who was a labor organizer falsely accused of a murder in Salt Lake City. And his trial was a sham, and he was executed by firing squad. But famously, he wrote in a letter before he died, "Don't mourn, organize." And his songs were an incredible inspiration to the union movement. And of course, Woody Guthrie comes right out of that period. Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, who followed him, spent their whole lives dedicated to social justice. And one young Bob Zimmerman, of course, came from Minnesota and saw Woody Guthrie on his deathbed in Long Island. That's how much Bob Dylan respected Woody Guthrie's work. And, of course, the early years of Dylan, when he was highly political, were so influenced by Woody.
Absolutely. And, we talk about Dylan. One of the things that popped out for me is the chapter where you were talking about Phil Ochs, because I was a Phil Ochs fan. I have most of his albums, and actually, Outside a Small Circle of Friends, I thought was great. But I learned so much from you that I didn't know about Phil Ochs. I remember as a kid watching him on the David Susskind show, of all shows, and he looked so misunderstood, but you filled in those gaps. Tell everybody about Phil Ochs, and we'll talk about some of the songs and his encounter with Dylan, where Dylan kicked him out of the limousine.
When I talk about music is power, I sometimes refer to the two tragic Phils. One is Phil Ochs, as you mentioned. The other is Phil Sloan, P.F. Sloan, who wrote Eve of Destruction and had an absolutely horrible life. Phil Ochs, of course, worshipped Dylan, and he spent his whole life writing brilliant songs, not only outside a small circle of friends, but Phil Ochs was into the movement in South America, in Chile. One of his friends was a guy named Victor Jara, Jara, who was the Pete Seeger of Chile. And when the Allende coup happened, Jara was lined up with a bunch of other people and shot down in a soccer stadium in Santiago. And this was devastating to Phil Ochs. Phil, of course, had bipolar disorder. I worked with Michael Ochs at KCRW, which is the NPR affiliate in Santa Monica, California, and I would talk to him about Phil. And it turns out from a documentary that came out later that Michael, like Phil, had bipolar disorder.
Mm.
So while Phil is writing all these incredible songs, sometimes even challenging people who supported him, like in a song like Love Me, I'm a Liberal, he would challenge anybody who he thought was false. And, he had to struggle with bipolar. Eventually, he became suicidal and he took his own life. But he left an incredible legacy. And just to close, the incident you mentioned with Dylan is wild. He adored Dylan, and Dylan always kind of withheld his affection for Phil Ochs. And once Dylan was doing a photo shoot. This is from Michael Ochs' brother, okay? So I consider this the definitive version of the story.
Yeah.
Dylan was having a photo shoot, and Phil Ochs was there. And then Dylan said, hey, why don't you come with me? And he gets into a limousine, and Dylan asked Phil Ochs, what do you think of my latest album? And Ochs, who was, undeniably honest, he couldn't hold anything back, said, I don't think it's good as your other stuff. I don't like this song. Can you please crawl out your window? And Dylan promptly stopped the limousine and threw him out. And for many years, they did not talk until, after the Chilean coup, which, by the way, involved the U.S. CIA and the corporation ITT. That's another story.
Mm-hmm.
Phil organized a wonderful benefit concert in Central Park, and Dylan came back, and they once again became friends just before poor Phil would take his life not long after.
Yeah, very sad. And I didn't know this. Outside a Small Circle of Friends, they had an edited version of it for radio because of complaints, because of the marijuana reference. A friend of mine got busted. And, I forgot the lyric off the top of my head. Was it 100 years he got sent? Anyway, they took that out. And he was about to have a kind of hit, but because of the
edit. He did get a lot of airplay, Alan. But part of Music is Power is showing the great changes that a lot of these musical artists engendered in the U.S., but a lot of them paid a terrible, terrible price. Not only Phil Ochs, but as I say, Phil Sloan, who wrote Eve of Destruction, which ironically was torn apart by some people in the rock establishment, people that you and I really, really care about. I mean, Paul McCartney, Paul Simon both attacked it for being too on the nose. And yet, in 1965, Eve of Destruction went to number one. It was banned. Again, sometimes the lyrics weren't weren't completely played. They'd have to do other versions, and sometimes the songs were outright banned, as in the case of Eve of Destruction and even Beatles songs early on. You remember the story about the Rolling Stones. This is not socio-political. Let's spend the night together.
Yeah.
Ed Sullivan didn't want them to sing that. To Mick Jagger's credit, he sang it anyway, and then got banned.
That's right. I know, but boy, that culture appreciated that. That's the kind of thing that was that glue I was talking about. And by the way, as we kind of explore this whole world, and you're going to hear lots of the music we're talking about, you got to keep in mind, this is pretty wide spectrum. It wasn't just in the 60s, or it wasn't even just the folk movement or the protest movement. We're talking about into the 80s, Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, psychedelic stuff. We're going to talk about Pink Floyd and The Who, and there's a lot of references to bands.
Green Day and Dixie Chicks make up the last chapter, Alan. I call that chapter Weapons of Mass Deconstruction.
Yeah. Because
the Dixie Chicks and Green Day were singing in response to the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Yep. And this is really jumping ahead, but I think it's a good time to just bring it out in the open here. Today, I wish we had more protest music, if you want to call it. I don't want to call it that, but there's some, and I know they're out there. But in this day and era, living with Trump, you would think that movement would come alive with lyrics, and it's just not happening like it should. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the epilogue of Music is Power talks about artists who are now condemning a lot of things that are going on. And I think that musical artists sometimes have to fight with their labels in order to say, I know normally do not do this kind of music, but we've made plenty of money for you, and it's time that you let us do this song. Lady Gaga did a great song about the shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, who was let off. And, certainly, Kendrick Lamar, that guy's not hurting for status. A lot of his words in his hip-hop music address social ills.
Right.
Eminem has done some very powerful stuff. So the question isn't whether people are still doing it. The question is whether the distribution of this music and the effect of this music can reach people. I would say, in closing on this topic, don't forget that part of the reason there were so many socially conscious songs around the Vietnam War is people were being drafted against their will and were killed and injured in Vietnam. Nixon was very clever and got rid of the draft, and all of a sudden that protest movement shifted. But God knows there's plenty more to worry about. We're drinking poisonous water. We're dealing with erosion of democratic rights, and on and on and on. And I think that the musical artists who are brave enough will always address those problems, because that's what happens in times of crisis, Alan. Art becomes socio-political.
Mm-hmm. So well put. So well put. The book we're talking about is Music is Power: Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change. New book by Brad Schreiber. Going back, let's go back to the 60s. Of course, we mentioned the marijuana reference was edited out on Phil Ochs' song Outside a Small Circle of Friends. That was a big issue, too, trying to legalize marijuana and drugs. And I remember a song by Grand Funk Railroad called Paranoid. And I don't know if you made reference to that in the book or not, but if you listen to the lyrics, it's about, Big Brother. Somebody is watching you. And it was a hard, kind of hard rock, kind of metal for its day.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing had a big impact with people as I was growing up, because the police and abuse of power and the overreacting to marijuana. Yeah. Big thing. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I remember Paranoid by Black Sabbath.
Oh, yeah.
And Black Sabbath has part of a chapter in Music is Power, where they kind of accidentally created the first metal, socially conscious song in War Pigs. And it was going to be Walpurgis, which is sort of a pagan, dark holiday, and they thought it sounded really cool and dark and satanic. And the label said, no, we're not going to call your song Walpurgis. And then the group said, well, what does it sound like? Sounds like War Pigs. So then they did something accidentally brilliant that I'm surprised wasn't done more in metal music. They equated Satanism and dark behavior with the military, much like Bob Dylan had done in condemning the military in Masters of War. Black Sabbath took it like 3 more levels and said the people that perpetrate war as a business, as a socio-economic function of the state, are more satanistic and dark than, people who have all these weird rituals. And I'm surprised. I think it's perfectly suited because metal music often uses images of darkness and blood and Satanism and all this other stuff, and there's so many things that you could equate with that darkness rather than just using shock value.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of journalists have called War Pigs not the best socially conscious metal song of all time, but the best metal song of all time.
Wow. Yeah,
it was an accident. It was an accident, Ellen, that they kind of stumbled onto that theme.
Wow. Yeah, that's very true. And I'm thinking about the impact that song had with me. I remember being in the dorms and playing air guitar and pretending it was a very passionate feeling, the anti-Vietnam War, the movement.
Mm-hmm.
That's very true. Very true. Before we get into the metal and the psychedelic and a whole bunch of things with Brad, I want to talk about, you wouldn't think this song necessarily as a protest song, but as I read about it, boy, you make a great point about Lesley Gore and the song "You Don't Own Me."
Yes, 1964. I do a couple things in Music is Power. I kind of challenge the general notion of when a movement began or ended. We were talking about Phil Ochs before, and everybody says, oh, the 60s and all the optimism and the beauty of it all ended with Altamont and, stabbings and all that. Well, I don't think so. I think Phil Ochs had it right, and I'll connect this to Lesley Gore. Phil Ochs did an album called Rehearsal for Retirement after the rioting at the 68 Chicago Democratic National Convention, where on national television we saw protesters in Grand Park being viciously beaten by the Chicago police. And by the way, of course, what were they chanting? The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching. And that phrase becomes used by the group Chicago Transit Authority, which of course then became Chicago.
All right.
So Phil Ochs' attitude, Alan, was not only the beating of the protesters in Chicago in '68, but the fact that the Democratic Party couldn't have Robert Kennedy as the next president because he was assassinated. Eugene McCarthy, the anti-war candidate, didn't have enough pull, and the Democratic Party nominated Hubert Humphrey, who was basically what you would call a corporate Democrat. And I agree with Phil Ochs, whose album, Rehearsals for Retirement, showed his gravestone with his actual year of birth, and it said on his gravestone, rather dark humor, that he had died in Chicago, Illinois in 1968, because he considered that the end of the 60s, and I think that's very accurate. Now, 1964 is the year that a woman named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And everybody says the women's movement was in the 70s. Well, I say it started in 1964 because that book, sold 1 million copies in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
and basically said women are are not just housewives and mothers. They have a right to equal pay. This is well before the Equal Rights Amendment. And the same 1964 is when Lesley Gore, as a teenager, goes to her producer, a young guy you might have heard of named Quincy Jones,
Right.
and says, I just got turned on to this incredible song, You Don't Own Me, and I'm tired of singing about how Johnny broke my heart and how I spent the whole night crying, and I want my next single to be You Don't Own Me. And it was so powerful because women had never held any kind of power in the music industry to talk about feminism. And You Don't Own Me to this day is covered a lot. It's been used in commercials and so forth and so on. That's a long time for a song to still have power in culture. And that was 1964.
Wow. Did she have other songs after that were socially relevant?
No, that's the interesting thing, Alan. Some of these artists only did one song that had a huge political impact.
Mm-hmm.
But my attitude is, even if it's only one song, that's one song more than they were preparing to do when they started their career.
Absolutely.
And in the case of You Don't Own Me, it had incredible resonance in the culture.
Absolutely.
Later on, she came out as being gay on a PBS show. So even though she had been kind of controlled in terms of her image as a musical artist, later on in life, she did a lot for what we would call LGBTQ or the gay movement by saying, look, I couldn't in 1960s tell you that I loved women because it would have ruined my career. But here I am on a PBS show telling you that this is how I live and now it's acceptable. So it's kind of fascinating. Sometimes the times have to catch up with the artist instead of the other way around.
Absolutely. Another great story. I was fortunate enough to have Peter, Paul, and Mary on the show a few times, and even after Mary has passed, I've had Paul on and Peter and you know something.
Wonderful.
I know, and what it's amazing. They kept up that social conscious attitude right up to the end, still to this day.
Yeah. I mentioned that in Music is Power, that they're both still involved in political causes.
Yeah.
Even though, well, I'm not exactly sure how old they are, but most people at their age either A, aren't around, or B, are, fishing at the lake. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I was lucky because I got to interview Peter and Paul with Theodore Bikel, who was one of the first musicians I ever heard as a young boy. He could sing in every language, and he was a phenomenal folk artist. But, Peter, Paul, and Mary's version of the Great Mandela.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up because I'll play that later in its entirety, but go ahead. It's
a phenomenal song, and as I discussed in Music is Power, it not only opens with, so I told him, Father, I will never kill another. So it's an interaction between a father and a son is refusing to go to war. And of course, what's the war going on at that time? The Vietnam War. But it also talks about what is your function in life, the Great Mandela. It talks about kind of an Eastern philosophy of, are you supposed to just live your life and to have as much happiness as possible, or do you have a responsibility to make the world better? And, when I wrote Becoming Jimi Hendrix from Steve Roby's research, he was a Hendrix historian, one of the people I interviewed was Richie Havens. And we got on the subject of the Great Mandela, even though we were talking about Jimmy, and he said, I think it's one of the greatest socio-political songs ever written. And the irony, Peter Yarrow wrote it later on in his career. They had been doing covers of other songs, of course, Dylan and many other traditional songs. And then they come up with this amazing song, The Great Mandela, and I remember talking on the phone with Richie, and he said, "Can you imagine, with the power of that song, all the songs he could have written before that one?"
That's
he
so
waited
true.
so long in his career to finally write a political song, and it was as beautiful as The Great Mandela.
Yeah, that I listened to that last night after reading what you wrote, and I actually thought of, wow, we could almost use that song today in a way with what we're dealing with in a different sense.
Absolutely, because it's not just about war.
Right.
It's about being conscious of the world around you and recognizing, unless you believe you're going to be reincarnated 14 more times, what is it you want to do while you're here?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk.
I don't think any other song that I can think of in popular culture even tackled that idea.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to. We're going to play that in its entirety. And Gil Scott, interesting. Revolution
Gil
won't be.
Scott-Heron, yeah.
Scott. Yeah, it won't be. The revolution won't be televised. I forget the name of the actual name of it. But boy, does that ring a
close.
bell?
The revolution will not be televised.
Yeah.
Gil Scott-Heron, which a lot of people consider him the godfather of rap music, which now everybody calls hip hop.
Yeah.
But I see it slightly differently because I'm slightly off center as a person, and I see Gil Scott-Heron as the guy who predated poetry slams.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think that hip hop music still has a responsibility to not only talk about gangster rap themes, but also to talk about the experience of being black in America. And Gil wrote and spoke, he sang sometimes, but he wrote and spoke poetry, which Brian Jackson would underscore with jazz or funk or soul music. And the revolution will not be televised, even though it uses lots of Nixon-era cultural references.
Right.
It's still an important song, and it's used all the time in our culture, for movies and whatnot, because it's questioning how when you want to change society, you can be undercut, you can be co-opted, how you can feel defeated and give up. He wrote so many fantastic songs, and then he went on to make fun of Ronald Reagan, who he called Ronnie Ray Gun.
Right. Oh, he was the one who coined that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and just magnificent poetry. And I think that's the message that we have to take from Gil Scott-Heron is, do any kind of music you want, but there is a place in hip-hop culture for melding street poetry, the poetry out of poetry slams, which is so vital and so powerful, and the music of hip-hop.
Yeah, this is great. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Frank Zappa. Boy, he did a whole chapter in his book about Frank Zappa. The book is called Music is Power, Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change, and a whole lot more coming up. Don't go away.
This is the Alan Handelman Show. Compelling talk radio.
Hi, this is Paul Rogers.
And this is Peter Frampton.
And this
is the
Alan Handelman Show, the talk show that rocks.
Oh, man. Welcome back. This is I'm the Slime, I believe is the cut from the great Frank Zappa. Wow, it brought goosebumps. Many of you know that I've had Frank Zappa on the show a lot, many times. From 1977, when Shake Your Booty came out, to just a couple of weeks before he died. And he just did so many things, and he actually was one of these unusual people who didn't really want to have a hit. He would talk about that, when Valley Girls became a hit or something got a lot of airplay. He didn't mind it, but that's not what he was looking for. And from his very first album, I remember a song on that first album, I think it was called Freak Out, called Trouble Every Day, about the Watts riots. And, oh, man, he hit it on the head. And then on an album he did called Broadway the Hard Way, he did a song called Jesus Will Think You're a Jerk. You remember that song, Brad?
Jesus thinks you're a jerk.
What a great,
I love the fact that we both knew Frank.
Yeah.
And, I knew him when he was involved with the battle against the Parents Music Resource Center in the mid-'80s, where Al Gore was part of a group of Congress people who were trying to censor rock and roll lyrics and the covers of albums. And he put his money where his mouth was and put up tens of thousands of dollars, and this is 1980s dollars, Alan, to fight it and to make people aware that we needed to stand up to this kind of censorship. Yeah, you can watch on YouTube his testimony in front of Congress, which is fantastic. But I was working with him for 6 months on a TV show he hoped to do late night called Night School. And he if anybody could be called a genius, it certainly was him. Not only because he was a composer and played keyboards and guitar and a producer and, an arranger. I mean, the guy had his own distribution, his own label, and on top of it, he was very, very politically committed. You're right. In Music is Power, usually the chapters are, maybe 2 or 3 different groups. But Zappa's life was so fascinating and on so many different levels that I had to give him his own chapter.
Definitely.
And I always tell people when I talk about him, if you want to truly understand why he was the iconoclast that he was, look to his childhood. His father was a meteorologist, and they were raised on the Edgewood Arsenal, which had the Army Chemical Corps. So his father would bring home bags of DDT that they were studying, and they lived like a mile away from tanks that had mustard gas. And Frank was very ill as a child. So you can imagine his attitude about the government when he was a child.
Right.
And seeing all this horrifying stuff. And then as he grew up, his intellect was so deep that I would go over to his house in the Hollywood Hills, and before we'd start working on the TV show, he would have C-SPAN on, and he'd be watching senators and congressmen debating stuff.
Yeah.
That's how into it he was.
He was into it. What year was that TV show he was working on?
That was so the PMRC testimony was in 86.
86, okay.
So it coincided with that.
Yeah.
And I think he was on one of these CNN political shows, Crossfire maybe,
right.
And some Republican senator objected to his activism, and Zappa said, "What, you're saying that I don't have the right to express my view on censorship?" And the guy says, "No, I don't think you do." And Zappa goes, "Kiss my ass."
Oh, yeah. Oh, I love
it.
Yeah.
So then I saw him at a symposium a couple of weeks later, and, I came up to him afterwards, shook his hand, and I told him that I had seen him on CNN, and he smiled at me and he said, "Man, haven't you always wanted to tell a Republican senator to kiss your ass on national TV?"
Yeah.
I'll never forget it.
Brad, we would talk a lot about politics, whatever was going on, and that was part of what I did on the show, and he loved it. He was great. An interesting story. I remember the first time I had him on, I think he was scheduled for an hour, and it was when Shake Your Booty was out. First time I ever had him on the program, and he was great. He was almost like the Frank Zappa from Apostrophe, the Yellow Snow album. He was funny. He was, using his deeper voice. He was using inflection. And he kind of knew that this was my first time with him, and there were misconceptions I might have had, but he was just excellent. And then about 30 minutes into the show, and he was really getting into it, he said, Alan, I really can't do the whole thing, and I'm not sure exactly what it was. There was some little issue at home, but he said, I'll tell you what, I'll come back and next week I'll do the whole show. I said, oh, you got a deal. And then that next week he came back. We were 3 hours taking calls, on every subject, and he was a little more calm because he wasn't, he was kind of like not doing an act on that first show, but he was trying to show me the vibrant, funny, and but he kind of got to the point where we were just having conversations, and it was just great. All through that PMRC, yeah, you brought back some great memories on that.
Oh, yeah. And even though he was critical of, all facets of society, obviously he made fun of people who took drugs, and especially the whole summer of love, psychedelic dungeons popping up on every street. I remember that line, from Who Needs the Peace Corps, right? So in some strange way, he even had an inkling of what was going on during the Summer of Love in 1967 in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, because what I found in researching Music is Power is Dow Chemical, the company that created napalm and Agent Orange, actually created a very dangerous psychedelic drug called STP and insinuated it into the drug culture. And it was a horrible drug where you were high for 72 hours and you couldn't relax. And so when Frank used to say, I think the whole Summer of Love was just a CIA construct, well, he wasn't exactly right, but he was right to a certain degree.
You're right.
Because they were afraid of youth mobilizing, taking drugs, and not just taking drugs, but changing their view of society and protesting against the way society was. And that's why Dow Chemical created STP, which was a horrible trip for so many people during that time.
Wow, you just brought back, that is so true. I remember on that very first show, one of the things I asked him to talk about is his allegation that the CIA was using hippies as guinea pigs for LSD. And he said, sure, I'll tell you. If he was a little surprised that I wanted to talk about that on the radio, but he did. And with, 5, 7, 10 years later, 60 Minutes is doing a show on that. And you touched on it with the great book, The Revolution's End. Yeah.
Yeah, I talked a lot about MKUltra, which ran from 1955 to about 75 by the CIA's program to use not only LSD, but like 120 other drugs to see what effect they would have. The idea being, can you coerce somebody to, work for you or perpetrate an act? There's a new book out actually called Poisoner in Chief about Sidney Gottlieb, who is kind of the head of MKUltra. I would recommend that to listeners if you want to know more, or Revolution's End, which talks about, of course, the Symbionese Liberation Army being created by the state to undercut the youth culture and especially the Black Panthers. I can't tell your listeners how much in the late 60s the Black Panthers terrified the FBI and the police. They really thought that there was going to be a revolution in the inner cities of the United States, led by the Black Panthers. And, of course, that's why they used all kinds of different double agents and anything they could to find out what was going on there. It was total paranoia, as you were talking about earlier.
Let's talk about Hendrix. Big part of what you wrote. And Star Spangled Banner from Woodstock, that was like a generational theme that was, without lyrics, had a lot of power.
Yeah, well, I knew Frank, and while I never met Jimmy, I did write Becoming Jimi Hendrix, and I got to feel like I really knew who he was by all the research of his early life. Again, I talked about Frank growing up on the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and that shaping his worldview. Well, Jimmy grew up in Seattle, very ethnically mixed, more ethnically mixed than most cities in the 50s and early 60s. So, he wasn't living in a segregated society, and it was very poor. His father was taking care of them. There was sometimes nothing to eat or no electricity in the house. So Jimmy was kind of a vagabond, and he was obviously ahead of the curve in terms of what he was doing musically. And you're right, the Star-Spangled Banner that we became familiar with from watching the movie Woodstock, but it was a song that he actually had been playing in clubs in his style maybe 50 times before Woodstock. It had a huge impact. I interviewed John McLaughlin of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, an amazing guitarist, obviously, in his own right. And I asked him about Jimmy, and he said the first time he heard the song, he was so choked up that he could barely speak. And this is something, Alan, I've seen a lot in rock journalism, where people ask about Jimmy and the Star-Spangled Banner, and the first time they heard it. I think of Brian Eno, the British composer and engineer and producer. He said he had tears pouring down his face the first time he heard it. It was just so powerful. And that's the way Jimmy operated. You know, even though that song didn't have lyrics, when there were lyrics, they were dreamlike, and they were about spirituality and consciousness. They weren't, you know, let's get out of Vietnam, or what are we going to do about racism, you know? Are You Experienced has that great line that I like to quote, which is not necessarily stoned, but beautiful.
Yeah.
So what other artists, I ask you, during the psychedelic 60s had the nerve to create a song that basically said, you have to get your mind together, as he put it. You need to spiritually evolve so that you can help make the world better. You want to take drugs? Fine, I take drugs. But that's not the only way to attain consciousness.
That's excellent.
And the end of that, Alan, is basically, Are You Experienced, unlike any other pop song, is saying you need to find a way to improve yourself before you start worrying about improving the world. And then slowly it will come about. And needless to say, that's a message that we didn't hear often of. And plus, musically, I think it's just one of the most remarkable songs ever recorded.
Are You Experienced? You know, I learned so much in your book, but I didn't know that, you know, he didn't want to overtly say, get out of Vietnam, war is wrong, because he was a military guy. I mean, he was in the military, so he had some loyalty for that. He didn't want to completely...
He understood that at the time there were a lot of people, primarily black and Latino, who did not want to serve, who got drafted, and economically they were struggling. And he was forced into the military. He was, you know, caught joyriding in a stolen car for the second time, and the judge said, you know, you can either go to jail, Mr. Hendrix, or you can join the military. And he saw a friend with a 101st Airborne Screaming Eagle patch and thought, oh, this will be fun. Well, he was a terrible soldier, but he eventually, you know, got out of the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and he and his soldier friend Billy Cox formed a band, and he got his chops together in Nashville, where some of the best guitarists in the United States were playing small gigs. And that's where Jimmy really developed the most as an artist. And then, of course, it was New York, bounced to London, and within 3 months, he turned the rock and roll establishment on his head and came back to America and Monterey.
Yeah. Oh, boy. There's so much more I want to talk about, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so I may extend it a few minutes, but I just got to tell everybody, when you look through the contents of the book just from the beginning, it has so many interesting chapters. There's one I'm saving, we're going to get to it a bit, about psychedelic. What do you call it? Weird, funny? No, what was the one about psychedelic? I think it was chapter...
Well, we've got, you know, Jimmy paired with Pink Floyd.
Oh, yeah, Floyd.
And I don't think people generally think of Pink Floyd as a socio-political group. But actually, I don't think there's another pop group in history that wrote so many powerful songs about alienation and mental illness.
Absolutely. The wall of, and, you know, absolutely.
And why did they do it? Because Syd Barrett, who founded Pink Floyd, lost his mind. And the big question, which I go into in detail in Music is Power, is did Syd Barrett lose it because he was doing a lot of LSD? Or was he already suffering the effects of mental illness and it drove him into a chasm of taking LSD? In either event, the group, I mean, that was a great tragedy, but it's an incredible irony because, Waters and Gilmour started, creating these amazing songs, Wish You Were Here, and, just really powerful stuff about alienation. And they were so moved by what had happened to their friend and band leader that they often in their careers would write these beautiful songs that express the terror of being mentally ill. There's someone in my head, but it's not me. Obviously, so many times this theme comes up in their work, and it's truly powerful.
It sure
and
is.
I think, Dark Side of the Moon, everybody talks about, it was on the charts for so many weeks, and it resonated with people. Well, yes, it's great, wonderful, spacey, psychedelic Pink Floyd music, which a lot of us love. But I think the themes in Dark Side of the Moon talk about struggling to find yourself and how you can become depressed very easily by reality. And I think that's something that especially young people are forced to deal with because they're trying to find their way in life. They're trying to separate themselves from parents. They're trying to make a living. It's very difficult. And I think youth culture will always respond to themes of alienation because that's the time in life when you're going through it the most.
Absolutely. By the way, Brad, I have read a lot of rock and roll books. I'm going through your book right now, and I know this is what I'm going to. Well, I have some time off around this time of the year. I got time. I'm going to read the whole thing. I learned things I didn't even know before. You
That's
really
wonderful.
dug up some fascinating things. I want to talk about the Who. I want to talk to Dixie Chicks. I want to talk about Green Day. We sure have a lot to talk about, but just. Go ahead. I think you were going to finish your point on what you were talking about. Then I'm going to move on to another band.
Well, no, let's go whichever way you want to go, because lots of these groups, I would say before I go back to you and the next group you want to talk about, lots of these groups have certain strengths. Pink Floyd's strength was very ethereal music and alienation and madness. John Lennon, I talk about the Beatles and John Lennon. Lennon really became unfettered and political after the Beatles were over, and those solo albums are incredibly powerful. Working Class Hero, the bitterness and the anger about society just drips off of him. So some people, do it with one song like Lesley Gore, and some people do it with a whole career like Pete Seeger and Peter, Paul and Mary. And some people just latch onto a theme, like Pink Floyd.
Hi, this is John Entwistle.
And this is Pete Townsend.
Of The Who, and you're listening to the Allan Handelman Show.
It's great to have you back. And I don't know if you took it this way, but even We Won't Get Fooled Again, to me, it sounded like it was talking about Nixon won't get elected again. This isn't going to happen again. I don't know if you took it that way.
I did. What I love about Won't Get Fooled Again, and by the way, just parenthetically, Pete Townsend was incredibly nice. When I wrote Becoming Jimi Hendrix, he had written a beautiful essay in Rolling Stone about Jimmy after he died and what he meant. And I wrote to him, and he gave us permission to use it on a website. He was really very kind to us, and I have a great respect for them. I actually saw them at the Hollywood Bowl just a few weeks ago. Their latest tour, and they sound fantastic. Roger Daltrey sounds really terrific. I think that Won't Get Fooled Again is a kind of a song that works on lots of levels. Absolutely about Nixon and here we are. You think that we would have learned, and now Trump, the worst president in U.S. history, who is threatening democracy on so many fronts. Well, how did he get elected? Did we learn nothing from the past? But the other thing I love about, Townsend's lyrics, he's pretty gutsy and he's pretty upfront about, weakness and his own weakness in wanting to be a star and saying, no, I don't want to be a star. I don't want to be in the, throughout Tommy, the themes are be your own person. Don't follow leaders. Don't blindly accept what people tell you,
right.
Which is, by the way, a very Zappa-esque
Mm-hmm.
sort of theme. And you see it throughout the Who's work. But you brought up, My Generation. Well, I love, and I mentioned the story of how there was a guy they referred to during the Mods and Rockers Day of London named Stuttering Jack. And he and a lot of people would follow them around because the Who were just outrageously tough. And the people who grew up in British society who didn't have much hope, young people, loved them for their gutsiness. And this guy named Stuttering Jack basically went up to the group after a gig and said, I love that song. You got to speak for us.
Yeah.
In his stuttering manner, he said to Townsend and the Who, we're the voiceless people, and you represent us. So please keep on representing us because no one else understands us. And that's something that no matter how big and successful the Who have become, they still go back to those days of the Mods and Rockers battles and people saying, you represent us, you're our voice.
Yeah.
And I think that's marvelous that they never sold out. I mean, the Who sell out. I mean, they're so conscious of being respectful of who their initial audience was. I think sociopolitically, they get high marks.
Absolutely. Who are you? Some of the later stuff, absolutely. Right on what you're saying.
Identity, being genuine, not being sucked in by leaders. Obviously, Tommy is all about that. That's a great theme that runs through so much of their music.
I want to talk about the Smothers Brothers, and a thought just popped in my head. If Fox News existed back in the early 70s, what would our generation do about it? Would we just let it be there, or would there be some kind of, it seems to me that a lot of people just ignored commercial right-wing talk radio and Fox News and just figured, okay, well, that's fringe. I'm not going to waste my time. And then now they got to the point that they almost have, more power than the other two combined, which is scary. But what would our generation have done if there was a Fox News giving misinformation back then?
Yeah, well, clearly, Fox News has become not so much a news-gathering organization that has a responsibility to objectivity, but it's propaganda. One thing, though, that's a continuum, I think, Alan, is people doing humor to deride what's going on.
Right.
And now you have all these late-night shows, so many of them, that talk about all the horrible stuff going on. Well, the Smothers Brothers, in the 60s had this unbelievable opportunity on CBS. They were basically a kind of a folk comedy duo that played the Bay Area a lot. They were from San Jose. And, they were summer replacement series, so CBS thought, well, we'll run these guys for 3 months and then they'll be gone and we'll go back to regular programming. And the irony is when they did the contract, Tommy Smothers, who was a very aggressive and out front kind of guy, said, we want complete editorial control of our show. We don't want the network to tell us what we can and can't do. And CBS, thinking, well, these guys are going to be gone in 3 months, what do we care? Agreed.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, the Smothers Brothers are doing, comedy bits about the war in Vietnam and pollution and racism, and CBS did battle with them. I go over the whole story in Music is Power. And Not only that, they gave Pete Seeger the opportunity to break the blacklist against him for rubbing shoulders with people who were, members of the Communist Party, although he was not one himself. And they said, we want you on the show, and helped him get back into popular culture by letting him sing a song called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, which was, a very subtle song about a lieutenant in the Army leading his troops into a river, trying to cross the river in Louisiana, and he drowns, and there's a connection to LBJ, getting America deeper into the war in Vietnam. 75,000 letters from people who were pro-Vietnam War came into CBS about that. Popular culture didn't really start changing about the war in Vietnam until 1968. And of course, a little later, LBJ said, I'm not running for re-election. So the Smothers Brothers, as comedians and musicians, became the number one show on television when they were supposed to only be there for 3 months. And they battled the censorship of CBS in order to talk about incredible topics. It's an amazing story.
How long did they last on TV? How many years?
I believe that they had 3 seasons, and there were battles all the way through. I'll give you an example of what they would do. Harry Belafonte sang a calypso song called "Don't Stop the Carnival," and it was a light, bouncy song about having fun and dancing in the streets. And "Don't Stop the Carnival," and on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, behind him was the image of the cops in Chicago at the Democratic Convention beating people. And here's, Harry Belafonte happily singing "Don't Stop the Carnival." That's the kind of stuff that drove CBS crazy, and that's the kind of stuff that amazed Americans who were socially conscious.
That's an incredible story.
There was nothing on television like it. There had been nothing even close to it.
And it's like you said, it's the humor. You love the guys. They make you smile, and then they're telling you the poison pill, basically, the stuff you need to hear, but they got it in there in a nice way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they wrote folk songs that were fun and politically topical, too.
Yeah.
So that was another way to make the medicine go down, put it into a little happy song. And this is something that Tom Lehrer did a few years earlier on That Was the Week That Was, who's also in Music is Power, wrote so many wonderful topical songs. 1960, before anybody was talking about the destruction of the ecology, Tom Lehrer wrote a song called Pollution. And it was very funny, but it was also saying we're going to be destroying our world if we keep up.
Yeah.
And the line I remember most when I heard it as a young boy was, "The breakfast garbage you throw into the bay, they drink for lunch in San Jose."
Yeah. By the way, his book deals with all kinds of music, the genres from metal, psychedelic, rap, punk, folk, soul, reggae. And we're just scratching the surface here of the
Even
bands.
country, believe it or not.
And country, I want you to briefly tell everybody about the Dixie Chicks again. You mentioned in the beginning, the Dead Kennedys. It's all in the book we're talking about just out. It's called, and this is perfect title, Music is Power. Can't miss the cover. It's kind of looks like the 60s. The subtitle, Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change. It's Brad Schreiber. Your website's bradschreiber.com? Is that?
Yes, it's actually Brash Cyber, BRASHCYBER.com.
Yeah.
No www.
That's right.
Just brashcyber.com. And I post wonderful interviews like this one on my Facebook page, and I'm on Twitter.
Yeah, I'll send you the link once we have it up. You had a great story about Pink Floyd, and you can get into the details. Actually, read it in the book if you want, but it's just Pink Floyd was on American Bandstand, and Syd Barrett was so strange. I didn't know this story you dug up. Tell everybody about that.
Well, there were many occasions, both on TV and in live performances, where Sid couldn't function. So at one point on American Bandstand, he was so losing his faculties that he wasn't even lip syncing the music, which went on a lot. A lot of lip syncing when you do TV appearances back in those days. And Roger Waters was like, "Uh-oh, our singer isn't pretending to sing. I guess I better pretend to sing." And there were other gigs, especially in London at clubs like the UFO Club and others, where, he would just stand on stage with his arms to his side or just plunk one guitar. He basically lost his ability to perform and communicate. And again, it was how much of it is the LSD that he's taking and how much of it is poor Syd Barrett had bad genes and went mad.
Yeah, remember that album Obscured by Clouds, I believe? It was from a movie. Yeah, he was a big part of that album, wasn't he? I'm thinking.
He was gone by then,
He
actually,
was?
Alan. But he wrote so different from Roger Waters and David Gilmour and the rest of the band. He wrote really quirky, oddball songs that were kind of like, almost like fairy tales or myths. Funny little songs about people stealing underwear off of clotheslines, and they completely changed. That's the amazing thing. It was a tragedy that led to Pink Floyd, as I said earlier, becoming really involved with songs about illness, mental illness, alienation, feeling separated from society, feeling hopeless and depressed.
Yeah.
And that will always work as a theme, especially for young people.
When I had Roger Waters on, I mentioned to him, I asked him to talk about Sid. I got the feeling he was reluctant the first time I had him on, and he finally opened up. And he didn't put him down in any way. He just talked about sickness as an illness, a mental illness kind of thing. Is the way I recall
they
it.
all loved him, And he was a handsome guy. He was incredibly charismatic, but he also didn't want to be a star. So there was that tension of, are we going to make a living, or are we just trying to be this really cool phenomenon in London that goes nowhere else? So I'm very fascinated by all the intricacies of the history of Pink Floyd, including the fact that Roger Waters' anti-war sentiment comes from both his grandfather in World War I and his father in World War II, both being killed in action.
There you go.
And I think that explains an awful lot about, when he did the wall and projected the names of soldiers on the wall. That's just a phenomenal history, incredibly tragic history, that of course shaped what Roger felt about society and war.
That's well put.
And I appreciate that so much. He's an innovator. He's not just a talented guy in music. He's a real innovator, and I think the tour of the Wall proved that conceptually he was head and shoulders above most rock and roll tours.
Isn't it ironic that we're talking about a wall that Trump is trying to build, and the wall coming down was what we were talking about and living in the 80s. Oh, my God. Anyway, look, go ahead.
It keeps coming around. History repeats itself, and we shake our heads going, what have we learned?
Yeah, well, how do we get here?
Vietnam War, and then you have Iraq and the Dixie Chicks, saying 10 days before the invasion of
that's where
Iraq.
I want to go. Go to the Dixie Chicks, and then we're going to end with Green Day. But go ahead. Tell everybody that story.
Yeah, well, it was like literally 10 days, Alan, before the U.S. illegally invaded Iraq based on non-existent weapons of mass destruction, that the Dixie Chicks were playing in London. And they're from Texas, and obviously George W. Bush is too. And they say, we just want to tell you all that we're ashamed that the President of the United States is from Texas. And they got a huge roar. And why did they get such approval? Because 90% of the British public was against the war in Iraq. and Tony Blair, against the will of 90% of the people, joined the U.S. in invading Iraq. And of course, you know, you can read about it in Music is Power, and you can see it in the documentary that Barbara Koppel made, two-time Oscar winner Barbara Koppel made in the documentary Shut Up and Sing. And I interviewed her. She was one of my favorite interviews. She is so brilliant. And she really lays out why the country music establishment, why radio stations, and why country music fans turned on the Dixie Chicks just for saying, you know, we don't approve of the President of the United States going to war, and how they basically tried to censor them. And of course, the irony is the follow-up after all of that was an album that yielded a beautiful song called Not Ready to Make Nice, where Natalie Main basically recounts the feelings of the public turning against her and actually threatening her life, which you can see in the documentary. They're in Dallas, and Natalie Main and the Dixie Chicks get a death threat. That is just so powerful.
It is. And I remember when that was happening, and I was thinking back, my God, what were songs like from Tom Paxton and Phil Ochs and Barry McGuire? I mean, how things have changed. You can't even criticize in such a light. I mean, that was really light. It wasn't a harsh criticism. It was just a mention.
Yeah. People say, you know, much worse things about Trump, and of course Trump says, you know, absolutely hideous things. There's no decorum. There's no civility. Each political party, you know, basically has to vote a certain way, or they're turned against and they replace them with somebody else. This is not the way to govern the most powerful country in the world. But there's also, you know, beyond all that stuff, there's a really great connection between the Dixie Chicks and Green Day, because Green Day's American Idiot came 2 years later in 2005, after the disaster of Iraq, where all of a sudden the American public was going, well, wait a minute, where are those weapons of mass destruction?
Right.
And wait a minute, Saddam Hussein was not responsible for the attacks on 9/11. And all of a sudden, you know, Green Day can do the things that the Dixie Chicks weren't allowed to do. They could do a concept album that's about young people who are just wandering about in life with the background of the Iraq War. They can criticize the president and nobody thinks twice about it. So sometimes socio-political music basically is so clever, it knows what the problem is, it identifies the problem, but the public doesn't know what the problem is. The public doesn't know the truth, and sometimes they react negatively against the music, where 2 years later, as in the case of Green Day, the public goes, oh yeah, that's a real timely comment about the Iraq War.
That's true.
Well, that's great. Where were you in 2003 when we could have prevented the war? You turned on the Dixie Chicks and you censored their music.
I think it was the audience that played that music on the radio, because the country audience was a whole lot different than the rock and roll or rock audience.
Yeah.
And Green Day
true.
has that kind of modern, it had a kind of a punk sound, even though it was commercial.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just seems like the country audience is very set in a conservative attitude. They want to have whatever was popular back then. I mean, what they're for back then compared to what some Republicans are for today, or you can't even compare them. But anyway, I don't know what I'm trying to say.
You're absolutely right. And I talk about that in the chapter, Alan, how the country music establishment had historically been very patriotic and viewed any criticism of America as hating America instead of what it really was, which is let's live up to our democratic ideals. We're all Americans and we're not leaving. We're trying to make the country better. I talk about briefly Jeannie C. Riley, who was a 60s country act who did a song called the Harper Valley PTA.
Yeah.
Kind of tongue-in-cheek, saying, oh, you're criticizing me for wearing short skirts? Look at what you do. You're an alcoholic. You had to leave town because you got knocked up by your boss. and she reverses it and points to the small town people and says, don't accuse me. You better take a good look at yourself.
Wow.
And that song by Jeannie C. Riley, her only hit, sold 2 million copies. So that was a rare and interesting example of country music going socio-political.
Yeah, and that was the one song that made it on Top 40 radio.
Yeah.
It crossed over formats.
Ken Burns' recent country music series, I really enjoyed it a lot. And what I enjoyed the most, even if I didn't like all of the music, is I loved hearing the stories of how these people grew up. So you would have someone like Merle Haggard, I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, inevitably support the Dixie Chicks when everybody was attacking them in country music.
Sure.
And saying, his quote was something, Alan, like, I don't know anything about the Dixie Chicks. All I know is they have a right to express their opinion just like any other American.
Exactly.
Even he, a country music stalwart, got that you don't have the right to censor these people because they disagree with you.
Absolutely. I want everyone, as you hear me mention the book, look on Amazon and read the reviews. I think every review is 5 stars. The book is called Music is Power, Popular Songs, Social Justice, and the Will to Change. It has so much music information, rock and roll, any genre, but it's, of course, my generation growing up, it was more of a rock and roll thing. It's funny. I had a teacher. He was one of the teachers that I had a lot of respect for, and he turned us on to Tom Paxton and Phil Ochs, even though,
how wonderful.
Right, it wasn't on Top 40 radio, these songs, but it was right at that time when I cared about so many things in the world. And that's what people forget, that kids do care. And it's not just a fad they're going through, or it's not like liberal professors brainwashing them. These are the things you would hear from conservatives back then about professors in college and liberal teachers. And,
I think that today we're seeing young people. I don't know who said this, but it really startled me with its clarity and brilliance. People were drafted and sent to Vietnam against their will, so of course there was a protest movement. Today I heard somebody say the Vietnam of today is gun control, because kids are losing their lives in schools, and the government is not doing anything to take automatic weapons. We're not talking about banning all guns. Won't even take automatic weapons, out of the hands of citizens. And it's become, for young people, especially those kids at Newtown, one of the most important issues of their lives. You see Greta Thunberg, winning international acclaim for basically saying, you're destroying our world and we won't have it. Not, we really wish you would change. She is really strong. And she's saying, how dare you? You're destroying the world. You don't have the right to destroy the world. Who do you think you are? You're limiting our ability to live our whole lives.
Absolutely.
It's
like the Lakeland high school kids. Those guys, those people
These
are brilliant.
kids are phenomenal.
I know.
Their commitment is so strong, and that's a hope. That's a great hope for the future.
Brad Schreiber, I really enjoyed this. I love talking music. I love learning new things, even though subjects that I know very well, there's still you can still learn. You did a lot of research in this book. Thanks.
Oh, I love doing it, and I really love talking with you about it, especially because you and I had personal interactions with some of these artists I talk about in Music is Power. So many, many thanks, Alan.
You are listening to The Alan Handelman Show